Thank you, Maria. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. And a very warm welcome to our panel titled Ancestors, National Heroes, World Heritage, the Meaning of Human Remains in Repatriation Politics. I'm glad so many of you could join us, and I hope we will have some interesting discussions today. Firstly, I would like to quickly introduce myself and my panel. I'm Sarah Fründt, Research Advisor at the Department for Cultural Goods and Collections from Colonial Context of the German Lost Art Foundation and one of the co-curators of this conference. With me on this panel are, in order of appearance, Professor George Okello Abungu, Dr. Fenneke Sysling, Dr. Caroline Drieënhuizen, Professor Nira Wickramasinghe, and Dr. Aranui. George Abungu is a Cambridge-trained archaeologist and former Director General of the National Museums of Kenya, and has been a guest scholar at the Getty Conservation Institute and the Getty Research Institute, and visiting professor and fellow in numerous universities worldwide. Among the many awards he received is the Lifetime Achievement in Defense of Art by the Association for Research into Crimes Against Art in 2012, and the Africa World Heritage Fund Award in 2016. His numerous publications address questions of archaeology, heritage management, illicit trafficking in heritage, restitution, museology, and heritage and sustainable development. George Abungu was Vice President of ICOM and Kenya's representative to the UNESCO World Heritage Committee. He presently serves as Special Advisor to the Director General of ICOM in Rome, Italy. Hello. Fenneke Sysling is an assistant professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands. She specializes in the history of science and colonialism, and her interests include colonial heritage, museum objects, race, the body, and natural history. Her PhD research, defended in 2013 at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, looked into the history of physical anthropology in the Dutch colonies. Her book, Racial Science and Human Diversity in Colonial Indonesia, was published in 2016. Her next project looked at the history of the human sciences and technologies of the self. It led, among others, to a special issue about measurement, self-tracking, and the history of science in the journal History of Science. She has also published on the history of colonial objects in natural history museums. Caroline Drieënhuizen is Assistant Professor of Cultural History at the Faculty of Humanities at the Open University of the Netherlands. She has published on collecting in colonial context, the transnational dimensions of colonialism, and the history of colonial objects in museums. Her last publication was on Dutch feminist icon Belle van Zuilen and her personal and literary works relation to colonialism. Caroline is presently working on the European cultural dimension of colonialism and Indonesia's decolonization in Indonesia, the Netherlands, and Europe, from a museological and material object-driven approach. Nira Wickramasinghe is Chair and Professor of Modern South Asian Studies at Leiden University in the Netherlands. She trained as a historian in Paris and Oxford and has written on late colonial and modern Sri Lanka using a variety of archives. Her most recent books include Slave in a Palanquin, Colonial Servitude and Resistance in Sri Lanka in 2020, and Sri Lanka in the Modern Age, A History in 2015. She is presently spearheading a small academic press in Sri Lanka called Tambapani Academic Publishers. Aranui, of Ngati Kahungunu and Ngati Tufaretoa descent, is the former project lead for the Ngakahu National Repatriation Project, which supports New Zealand museums and iwi in the return of ancestral remains held in museum collections. She's a founding member and former chair of the New Zealand Repatriation Research Network, set up to assist repatriation researchers to work collaboratively with the aim of proactively returning ancestral remains back to iwi, Apu, and other communities around the world. Amber has worked to develop the national policy on repatriation for the New Zealand museum sector, and is also working with her own iwi on repatriation initiatives relating to the return of Taonga. Recently, she has taken up the position of Curator Matauranga Mari at Te Papa after having been the researcher for the Karanga Aotearoa repatriation program for 11 years. Her interests and publication topics include the research, collection, and trade of human remains, and the effects on indigenous peoples throughout the world, how repatriation relates to ethics, provenance research, indigenous perspectives, community collaboration, and human rights. We are deeply honored and grateful to have all of you here as our guests today. Welcome. Before I hand over to the presentations, I would like to start by giving you a glimpse into how this panel came about. You will have noticed that it combines the case studies that so far are rarely thought of in a comparing way. It is bringing together the repatriation of the remains of those more recently deceased with fossilized remains of those ancestors in the human evolutionary line that have lived several 100,000 or even million years ago. While this might be unusual, it is not inconceivable. Apart from them all being subject of a long history of repatriation requests, many of which started already several decades ago, they also share a similar fate. They have been removed from their grave or burial place, or were prevented from being laid to rest by the descendants in the context of colonial acquisition. And they have ended up in storage and museum spaces and as figures and icons of discourses, narratives, political and scientific struggles without their own contribution. Without anticipating the actual presentations too much, I would like to open up a few lines of thought and raise some questions that interest me in this combination. First, when do we think about individual remains or bones as people that require a certain treatment in line with ethical considerations and or the wishes of the descendant communities? Why is the treatment and return of paleoanthropological remains seldom voiced in these terms, although we consider them as our own ancestors and imbue them with names, faces, agency, and a narrative of their personal life? Second, how can remains of individuals, no matter their age, become symbols and icons for nation states that have not even existed when they lived? How can individual lives become intertwined with questions of nationhood and national politics, making the national hero emerge and the individual disappear? Third, whose heritage is at stake? In discussions and negotiations on repatriation, which arguments come to the fore and which are stepping back? And how do these questions relate to power imbalances and different ontologies? 4, one element shared in nearly all debates around repatriation is that of absence and loss. What might have been missed and what was lost by the absence of individual remains or evolutionary ancestors? And how can this void be adequately voiced and addressed? How would a return relate to this loss? And lastly, how can the universal narrative of human evolution be reconciled with national or local identity and individual multi-histories? How can the writing of evolutionary stories avoid colonial tropes of hierarchy and linear development and incorporate a multitude of narratives? Is paleoanthropology as a discipline still conceivable in a post-colonial setting? With these preliminary sketches, I'm hoping to give you some potential avenues for thinking and discussing about the following cases to come. As was the case with the other panels, there will be no Q&A between the talks, but there will be an open discussion at the end. So to the audience, please keep your questions, responses, and comments in mind and share them after the talks have concluded. And I would now like to give the floor to the experts on my panel and again offer my deepest gratitude for them being here to share their knowledge and thoughts. Our first speaker is Professor George Abungu. His talk is entitled "The Lost Past, Reclaiming a History and Identity Broken." And without further ado, I would like to hand the mic over. George, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Let me first start by thank you Larissa, yourself for really, being with me in this journey and joining you today. This is an extremely important topic for me. In 2018, I was invited by the government of Senegal to help in setting up the Cradle of Humankind story in what is called the Museum of Black Civilization. And that is actually when I realized that Africa has a lot to offer in terms of development, ranging from the time of Tumai, which is 7 million years ago, coming all the way to Olorin at 6 million, all the way to Lucy and to Kanaboy, between 3.2 to 1.5, to the Zinj at 1.75 million years, to Broken Hill. Out of all that, I was a little bit confused which one to deal with when I was asked to talk about this. So I chose two, Broken Hill case, and also Zenjanthropus Boise from Tanzania. I want to talk with the voice of the people who live with this, who own this, who come from these places. The first slide, please. If someone can put on my slides. Heritage and this particular heritage that we're talking about, and about restitution and about heritage that is held in particular areas, it's about people. It's about these faces that you are seeing here, the grandmothers, the young children, the elders. It's about their environment. It's about their connection with the earth. It's about their connection with themselves. It's about the symbolism, their spirits, their journey all the way as humanity. Next, please. So I chose two particular examples. The Broken Hill as an example to take you through with a voice from the Zambians in terms of a heritage that has been kept captive outside that particular country. And on June the 17th, 1921, 100 years ago, a skull was discovered in northern Rhodesia, then northern Rhodesia, present day Zambia. Now, it was one of the best preserved fossils due to the nature of the place it was found in a limestone. And it was described as the most important single hominid find in Zambia since the country opened up to scientific research at the turn of the century with colonialism. But the skull was immediately taken to England in the same year in 1921, where it was donated to the British Museum of Natural History in London. Next, please. You can see that skull. At the time, Northern Rhodesia, which is present-day Zambia, as I've said, was under the administration of the British South African Company. Now, the company, of course, as a colonial company, had developed laws of legal frameworks through which things like this could be done. But despite the existence of the legal framework that was existing to regulate the removal of any such finds from this territory, the company itself, on whose land it was found, made this donation to the British Museum of Natural History without obtaining any export permit. Next, please. What is the importance of this? Why are we talking about it? The hominin specimen is critical to understanding particular point in the development of early humans, as Sarah has already mentioned in her introduction. It provides a great insight into critical stages in human development. It also represents one of the best preserved crania in this range of subspecies, which was called Homo rhodensensis, with outstanding features. In the context of hominin evolution, the skull occupies an immediate position between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens sapien, which is basically between the Homo erectus and ourselves, which are found in North Africa, in Europe, and in the Near East. Is an excellent example of the varied emergence of modern human characteristics in Africa, Africa being the cradle of humankind. And in the beginning, I mentioned this particular museum that is talking about Black civilization, which also tries to explain the contribution of Africa to the world in terms of human evolution. Next, please. Now, the skull represents the hominin of the Middle Stone Age period. It's in a unique area of Africa. It made tools, and tools were critical for behavioral shift in these early hominids because it gave them an important advantage beyond their natural biological abilities, so they could do other things. And so it is so much important for the study of human behavior. It has continued to contribute to the interpretation of the evolution of Homo sapiens sapiens from Homo erectus and our understanding of the lineage of that has led us to modern humans. It also had a hole on its left side, which has always been attributed to the fact that this individual was afflicted with a sharp instrument during his life. But that did not cause his death, but it shows that probably there were also conflicts at that particular time. And so we can be able to learn from this particular skull. Next, please. But even at that time, it was recognized as a valuable cultural, economic, and scientific product from Zambia, from Africa, when it was taken away. More so, it is a pride to the people of Kabwe. Kabwe is the place where it came from. The Broken Hill place has been renamed Kabwe. And the skull itself in Zambia is now known as the Kabwe skull. Even the colonial time, during that time, the colonial period, the colonial government also recognized it. You can see it in the middle of the town's coat of arms, which showed its significance, that it was a significant find in that particular place. And today, the town of Kabwe has actually dedicated a street in the name of that Broken Hill skull. Next, please. So, to the Zambian, what does this mean? According to their opinion, they feel that for as long as the skull remains locked up in the British Museum, in the Natural History Museum, there will be no end to colonization for this African fossil. So this brings us to the question of the issue of decolonization, that as long as some of these things that mean a lot to the countries that call themselves independent today, there is no finalization of the colonial agenda. The Zambian government, through the National Monuments Commission, which is the body entitled to discuss these things, made a formal request as long as 1974 for the return of the remains of the Broken Hills. They were relying on the 1912 legislation that had been developed by the British. To their surprise, the response was that the Natural History Museum is governed by a board of trustees who are mandated by law to safeguard the museum's collections. And therefore, they were reluctant to give the object out, especially if the object was bequeathed, in the past, like this particular one here, by another organization or donated. The other justification that we hear quite often when it comes to issues of return and restitution is that this particular skull is much more accessible in London because London is central. So that is another, or that it is better protected security-wise and can be exhibited, and that the storage is much better. And also that the skull belongs to humanity and not just Zambians. Next, please. It is, so you have a pain of a nation because of a find that is so significant to them. It is argued that the continued hold by the Zambians argue this, that continued hold on this skull has denied them of so many things. For example, international public appreciation because of the colonial tag that it carries. So it's basically robbed the skull, and therefore the person of the Broken Hill, the identity and the dignity that it deserves. So the reluctance to return it to Zambia poses an ethical question of the colonial bondage that continues to haunt the country itself up to the present. So in a way, when you say that London has center, London has better facilities, it implies that Zambians are incapable of looking after their own hominid fossils, and that they have to depend on the British to do that. And it's also been noted that besides publications that were done in the 1920s that followed this discovery, nothing has really been done of any scientific significance. But if it was in Zambia, it could be attracting more scientists to come in there. Next, please, and learn more about that. Local researchers also have not been able to utilize this substantial and sophisticated information that comes or accrues from this because they cannot access it. And this has led to no stimulation of hominid-related economic activities, such as benefits that accrue from studies that might have been done on this particular hominin, including castes. And we know that most institutions nowadays that are engaged in the research in terms of hominid are making casts for studies for universities and other places, and these are sold. So that denies Zambia this resource. We also know that traveling exhibition of original hominin, for example, you can see on the right hand there, the Lucy from Ethiopia that was excavated in this Rift Valley area, has traveled widely in the United States and other places. And every time it moves around, it generates a lot of money in terms of millions of dollars. Other countries like Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, South Africa have really been engaged in this, so that there is this partnership and exchange with other institutions which bring in financial benefit and also scientific benefit. Zambia cannot do that because it does not own its own heritage that was taken away. Next, please. So the country involved, as I've said, have benefited. And also, if you look at other countries, for example, the one that I'll be talking about in just a few minutes, Olduvai Gorge, where this Janthrospus was discovered. You have hundreds of scientists coming every day to Tanzania now to go and look at the different status there. But this also happens in other places, for example, in Taung, in Sterkfontein, Makapatat, Kromdrai, Swartskran, Turkana in Kenya, Omo. You have huge amounts. And with that, you also have capacity building taking place within the countries. And yet, this could be the same with Zambia. Probably this kind of activities could have been taking place if this particular skull was left in the country. Next, please. But for over 4.5 decades, since it became independent, the knowledge of human development and the contribution of the country to the study of human origins has stagnated because there is no drive, because there is nothing to attract. There is no magnet. The magnet is lying somewhere in London with those reasons. So since the late 1950s, little work has been done in the fossil-rich region, and Zambia straddles Southern Africa and Eastern Africa. And we know that this is an area of extremely rich hominid finds, but nobody bothers to do that because people have lost interest. There are no people who are trained. And this particular hominid could have spurred a lot of other discoveries to take place. So the paleontological discoveries died out with the conclusion of, with the laboratory study of this particular skull when it moved to this. And this has basically disadvantaged the country as a whole from benefiting from its research and other insights in human origins. Next, please. The reason that I gave at last when we were talking about this, that London is center, that it has all those facilities. We know that Zambia also has places like the Livingstone Museum that has got, one of the best museums in Africa, which could easily have this, could attract people. And so they are saying, with the minimum entry visa required in this particular country, compared to the strict and restrictive entry requirements in Britain, that has been imposed on people for you to go there, and now with COVID-19, even more complex, probably Zambia would be much more easier accessible to professionals and other visitors if this was taken back. That is them saying that. Next, please. The next one is Zinjanthropus boise, which is Tanzania. It's only 15 minutes, so I'm moving very fast. In 1959, the paleoanthropologists, Mary and Louis Leakey, discovered a very important human hominin that they named the Nutcracker at Olduvai Gorge, very important site. The skull was then moved to Kenya, where Louis was curator and later director at the Corridon Museum, later became National Museums of Kenya, which I was also director general at some stage. And it stayed there until 1965 that the skull was presented back to Tanzania. But here is the story. Next, please. The Nutcracker man, or Zinjanthropus, or Paranthropus boise, is absolutely one of the most famous hominid skulls to be found. It was discovered by Mary Leakey at Olduvai Gorge, Tanzania, and has been dated to 1.75 million years. It was dubbed the Nutcracker because of its huge molar that you see on the right-hand side, which is indicative of a vegetarian diet, that he was eating vegetarian. It's one of the first hominid discoveries that showed that evolution of humanity took place in Africa. And so it belongs to a line of hominins called Homo habilis, of line which the human ancestors are perceived to have come from. So you have Homo habilis, then Homo erectus, then Homo sapien, and Homo sapiens sapiens. So it's very crucial. Next, please. Now, Louis and Mary had been working in this area for a long time in the rich lava flows of this particular deposit, the Rift Valley. And in 1959, they found it, named it Zinjanthropus boise by Leakey. But there were also other finds, which included tools that had been classified as older one. These are the first tools that were made by these hominins. And there were also bones and teeth. Other bones actually had contained marrow had been broken, they had been split, which meant that these individuals were actually capable of splitting these things. There were also cut marks on the bones. So it shows you that they were intentionally doing that. So at that stage of human evolution, they were actually developing characteristics that were leading. But Olduvai had also produced later specimens of the Homo habilis that included Homo erectus. I mean, after Homo habilis, they included Homo erectus or Homo egesta. And these also developed older one industries. Next, please. Next. In addition to that, at this particular time, the problem was the colonial powers had favorite colonies. And in West Africa, you had Senegal, in East Africa, Kenya, and Southern Africa, you had South Africa. Most scholars who came worked in these places. And for example, East Africa, the National Museums until independence, which was called the Corridon Museum, was where Leakey worked. So he brought everything there. Next, please. I'm just about to finish. Next slide. Now, so with the support from international organizations and patronage from colonial administration, all these things like the Nutcracker and other finds were brought to Kenya. So it stayed there. That means that the Kenyan National Museums were able to sell the casts and others. And it was not until 1965 when this material, the Nutcracker, was returned back to none other than the president, Julius Nyerere, Kambarage Nyerere, was handed over by Leakey. Now, what we see here, as noted by others, including some of the scholars in Germany, is that it was also supposed to signal the movement of the bulk of Tanzanian forces back to Dar es Salaam. And that was symbolizing the reclaiming of a national heritage from a scientific dominance of the Kenyan neighbors who had been patronized by the colonial powers. Next, please. I think that's the final sort of slide. So while the Nutcracker found its way back into Tanzania, the others remained here. Now, this demonstrated the colonial project of appropriation and retention that never ended. So it continues. More so, it also demonstrates that issue or restitution is not only a north-south issue, but also a south-south issue. And finally, that restitution should not just be about objects appropriated during colonial times, but also human remains, including hominin remains that were appropriated during that time. Last slide, please. So my conclusion is that the last solution is that it is clear that the loss of heritage, whatever form it is has got negative consequences. They could be economic, they could be cultural, they could be scientific, religious, ethical, or otherwise. So the cases of Broken Hill and Nutcracker demonstrate injustices originating in the colonial time that continue to disadvantage communities up to the present. And the solution lies basically on frank discussions, on acceptance of past mistakes, including the injustices that were done, and correcting the same. And if need be, and their need should be, restitution according to the wishes of the peoples and the states of origin of these ancestors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George, for that really powerful talk and for trying to fit in all these ideas and thoughts into 15 minutes. That was really amazing. And I liked how you picked up so many of my initial thoughts already in your presentation. And yeah, and also mentioning the question of access and visa requirements, which we actually had a couple of times already during the conference. I'm looking forward to the discussion later. Yes, so for now, next in line are Fenneke Sysling and Caroline Drieënhuizen, and their talk will be on Java Man, Indonesian claims and natural history museums. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Caroline.
Yeah, I'm here, but I'm not, I have a lot of internet issues at the moment and I'm turned upside down, I guess. Okay, you should do it without video. Sorry. Okay, let me share my PowerPoint. I hope everyone can see. Fenneke, can you see it?
Absolutely.
Awesome. So thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I returned to university to haven't have any Wi-Fi issues, and then I have some Wi-Fi issues. It's so annoying, but I guess it's just part of this time, or this crisis we are all in. Okay, so let me start. My name is Caroline Drieënhuizen, and together with Fenneke Sysling, we present this paper. I will start, and Fenneke will take over halfway. And as you might notice, we have changed our title, not from Natural History Museums, so Restitution Claims and Natural History Museums, we've changed it into Natural History Objects, because we mostly speak about objects. So what we will do in this paper is to trace the long contested political ownership and stakeholders of a collection fossilized remains of Homo erectus that goes by the name of Java Man. And while tracing these fossils, we observe that the debate on the restitution of the Java Man fossils has had a different outcome than that of similar other fossils. And we will explain you why this has been the case. So only very recently, natural history objects like Java Man or Broken Hill Man, as George talked about, have become reluctantly part of the debate on restitution. And in some respects, this is very remarkable, for as we will point out, Java Man in particular has been a contested specimen and part of discussions about repatriation already in colonial times since the 1930s. In the following, we will first show the colonial context of the discovery of the bones, followed by an analysis of Java Man's repatriation discussions until Indonesia's independence in 1945 and after, set against the actual restitution of another set of fossils. So first, I'd like to give you a bit of a background. Java man is a famous Homo erectus fossil, currently at the Naturalis Museum in Leiden in the Netherlands. It consists of a skull cap, a molar, and a thigh bone, and it was excavated on the island of Java in Dutch colonial Indonesia in 1891 and 1892. The story of Java man is closely connected to that of Eugène Dubois, a Dutch medical doctor with an interest in fossils and evolution. Because of Ernst Haeckel's suggestion that tropical Asia may have been the birthplace of mankind, Dubois joined the Dutch East Indies Army and was able to start searching for fossils in colonial Indonesia. Because of the help of earlier Indonesian scholars, the Indonesian population and many Indonesian forced laborers, Dubois was able to find the fossils. And at that time, so at the end of the 19th century, and for more than 3 decades, Java man was the oldest human specimen that was ever found. And when Dubois returned to the Netherlands in 1895, he took the Java man fossils with him as his personal possessions. And even before Dubois' death in 1940, in the 1930s, there had been already a dispute about whether the fossils were owned by the Dutch nation state or by the Dutch colonial government in Batavia, nowadays Jakarta, because Dubois had been employed by the colonial government. So one could say that already in colonial times, there was a political demand for the restitution of the fossils to its place of origin. Indonesia's independence in 1945 meant the start of restitution claims and discussions between 2 nation states. In 1951, Indonesian politician Muhammad Jamin demanded in the press the restitution of several Indonesian objects then in Dutch hands. And one of these objects were the fossils of Java man. Java man, Jamin claimed, had to return to Indonesia, and now I cite Jamin, in the interest of the Indonesian nation and its people. Not only Jamin condemned the Dutch inclination hanging on to objects like Java man as mere cultural imperialism, but perhaps more importantly, Java man was particularly important for Jamin in the new nationalistic narrative he had constructed. Because Jamin was trying to shake off the colonial historical narrative of the former colony, Indonesia, and he had formulated a new story in which the influence of colonial rule was minimalized and pre-colonial domestic strength was stressed. Java man and other fossils functioned in this narrative as the scientific proof of Java being the oldest island in the world and the birthplace of mankind. With objects like these fossils, the past, so history as it has been written down, was claimed back, appropriated, and possessed by the new Indonesian nation. The unofficial claim was reiterated in the 1970s as a result of the 1973 UNESCO resolution on the restitution of works of art, a resolution that, by the way, was not signed by the Netherlands. And this led to some nervous activity by Dutch government officials, but the fossils were never handed back to Indonesia. The Dutch substantiated this unwillingness to return the fossils by stating that the objects had been obtained legally and that science was in fact very objective and very universal. The director of the Natural History Museum in Leiden, where the fossils were stored, Willem Vervoort, you can see him on the slide, stated for instance, that Indonesia's claims of repatriation were, and I quote, nonsense, and that he would do his, and I quote again, utmost to prevent the distortion of my institute by handing over the most valuable objects, end of quote. Vervoort made a distinction between cultural and scientific heritage. Scientific heritage should not, he stated, be discussed with emotional and nationalist arguments like the Indonesian party did. And this was, of course, a very Western-centric and very colonial opinion, and demonstrated Vervoort's inability to emphasize with Indonesia's needs. And this Dutch lack of attention for the sentimental value of returning objects to their former colony was already observed and condemned by American scholars in 1949. Fenneke will take it over from here.
So, hi everyone. I'll continue from here. As Caroline said, the 1970s ended with a sort of stalemate between the Netherlands and Indonesia. Even though there was no official claim in the 1970s, government officials continued to work on the case, while Willem Vervoort, the director of the Natural History Museum, made sure that his arguments were heard in the press. One of the unofficial claimants from Indonesia was Teku Jakob. And I'm hoping that
I tried to
is giving me the next slide.
Yeah, I tried to. Oh, there he is.
Great. Teku Jakob would become Indonesia's most famous paleontologist and also the most infamous, but that's another story. But while these claims led to nothing with regards to Java men, Jakob did have more success with another museum. The Senckenberg Museum in Frankfurt had housed fossils from Java that arrived there in the possession of Ralph von Koenigswald, a paleontologist who had been born in Berlin and had worked in the Dutch East Indies. In the 1930s, von Koenigswald continued Dubois' work on Java, and he joined the Geological Survey of the Netherlands Indies. This geological survey did geological work, but also paleontological research. And as part of the survey, von Koenigswald excavated the so-called Ngandong skulls in 1931 and the Mojokerto child skull in 1936, all on the island of Java and named after the villages and towns where they were found. Today, these skulls are all known as Homo erectus fossils. This is what the Ngandong skulls look like. There are 14 of them, and you can see that they're on the slide, you can see 10 of them. And you can see that these are many more fragments than the 3 Java men fragments, and that some of the skulls are actually a lot more complete than the Java man skull. And as you can see on this slide, von Koenigswald could not have done his work without the help of the local population. One of his most important fossil finders was Andoyo, the man in the middle on photograph A. He was the one who dug up the Mojokerto child skull. Von Koenigswald was fired in 1934 from the Geological Survey, and he was rehired for a while he was rehired back as a consultant for the same Geological Survey in 1936. And this is important later on in our story, because von Koenigswald would continue to search for and to find fossils in the late 1930s, but by then he was no longer paid by the Dutch colonial government. After the Second World War, von Koenigswald became a professor in paleontology at the University of Utrecht. The skulls had survived the Japanese occupation of the Dutch of Indonesia and also the Indonesian War of Independence. In Utrecht, Teku Jakob, the claimant of in the 1970s, became von Koningswald's student, and he wrote his PhD thesis with him. Now, when von Koningswald retired, he moved to the Senckenberg Museum and Research Institute in Frankfurt, where he was invited to run a department devoted to paleontology. The fossils went with him. This angered the Dutch, but there wasn't much they did or could do. So then the skulls were at Frankfurt. In the late 1970s, von Koningswald returned the Ngandong skulls and the Mojokerto child's skull to Teku Jakob and to Indonesia. The Indonesian embassy was present during the ceremonial return, so it was not entirely unofficial, but it was still a sort of a low-key return. One of the arguments for the return of these skulls, and not of other skulls still at the Senckenberg Institute, was that these specimens were dug up by the Geological Survey. And because Indonesia was the successor state to the Dutch East Indies, it was therefore the rightful owner. This argument worked well to mark the difference between the skulls that von Koningswald did return and many others that he dug up in the late 1930s when he no longer worked for the Geological Survey. And these skulls he did not return to Jakob, they're still in Frankfurt. But the same argument is of course also true for Java men, because Eugène Dubois had also been paid by the Dutch government, the Dutch colonial government, for his work. But we did not find any evidence in the archive that the Dutch government officials worried a lot about this precedent. The official documentation of the return also said that the skulls were protected and safeguarded with great personal risk during the time of the Japanese and in the difficult period afterwards, the War of Independence, by Dr. and Mrs. von Koningswald. Now, the fact that von Koningswald had kept these skulls in his possession was called safeguarding, a very nice way to describe the fact that von Koningswald had actually brought the skulls with him wherever he went. Nevertheless, this must have been a very satisfying outcome for Teku Jakob. So to come to our final slide, what explains the different trajectories of these skulls from Java? Java man was officially claimed in the 1950s and unofficially in the 1970s, but did not return, while many of the von Koningswald skulls did. Most importantly, von Koningswald had succeeded in making the skulls his private collection. And his move to Germany moved the skulls beyond the grasp of the Dutch. And apparently, even within the Senckenberg Institute, he was able to decide himself on the fate of the skulls. Dubois also considered the Dutch collection his own, and he kept Java men close to himself as long as he could. And it took the Dutch government decades, but they were finally able to secure the skull for the Natural History Museum. And in the Natural History Museum, Java men was owned by the Dutch government and remained part of the museum's nationalist politics and ongoing colonial mentality. Another thing that may have played a role to explain the different trajectories is the fact that Java man is the type specimen for Homo erectus. A type specimen is the first of a new species that is described, and therefore for biologists, the reference point for the species in every publication about this species. So this type specimen is scientifically more valuable than any other next specimen that is found. At the same time, because of its name, Java man also has more cultural value on Java than the other skulls, because it still supports a story about how Javanese history goes far back. So the stakes with Java men were and still are higher than for the other skulls. And finally, perhaps it was also the personal relations between von Koningswald and Teku Jacob that played a role. These men could organize informally and between themselves what larger structures could not. And I want to leave it at that. I have one more thing to say, and that most of what we've been talking about is already published in Caroline and my own article, Java Men and the Politics of Natural History, if anyone wants to know more. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Fenneke and Caroline, and also for mentioning and explaining what a type specimen is, because with the skulls that George mentioned, those two are actually also the type specimen for the respective species in this case. Our last paper is Professor Wickramasinghe, and her talk today is titled "The Making of National Objects, the Return of a Throne and a Skull in Colonial Sri Lanka." And I hand over the microphone to you.
Yes, so thank you very much for inviting me to speak. It's an immense pleasure to be here. So my presentation draws from, oops, I can't share, okay, right. So my presentation actually draws from three published texts that I'm revisiting nearly 20 years after their publication, giving a more central focus to the process of claim making and return. So in these earlier papers, I argued that claims for the return of objects emerged in the first decades of the 20th century in a context of Buddhist revivalism and anti-colonial stirrings in Sri Lanka, then called Ceylon. So taking the return of a Kandyan throne and the skull of a Kandyan hero as examples, I showed that Kandyanness associated with the Kandyan kingdom that you can see on the map, you know, in sort of light gray, the last to fall to European powers, was imagined as the authentic, unsullied traditional culture of the new nation state, and how these objects were given new meanings once returned to a national space. So my paper today explores further the manner in which new leaders of the nation state in the making found it crucial not only to fashion a narrative of authenticity, but to give it materiality through ritualized acts that involved claims for the return of certain objects taken away by colonial powers and their reinvention as national relics. These objects, throne, guns, paintings, cranium, became endowed with a kind of sacrality akin to that of relics as they meandered through processes of appropriation, claim making, and return. So in this presentation, I'll briefly clarify the role played by the British colonial state in defining Kandyan Sinhalese culture and the redistribution of Buddhist relics, paving the way for cultural claims and later acts of return. The claim and return of the Kandyan throne demonstrates how and why a hybrid artifact became a national sacred object, while that of Kandyan Disava Kapatipola's skull exemplifies the limits of state power to appropriate and define the meaning of objects. So in the early 20th century, in parallel to the nationalist movement's overtures to the Kandyans and eventual absorption of Kandyan symbols into the neonation, colonial rulers too were defining what in their view were the emblems of the authentic Ceylon. The new Ceylon would be ruled by its majority population, the Sinhalese, among whom Buddhists, the largest religious group, would take pride of place. The study and preservation of Sinhalese texts was encouraged, and a respectful tone adopted towards indigenous arts and medicine, among other examples. By the 1930s, this policy was being adapted to the political sphere, with the introduction of universal suffrage and self-government, laying the foundations for majoritarian Sinhalese rule. Buddhist relics had played a central role in the pre-colonial era in the formation of new Buddhist polities and in the legitimation of state authority. Under colonialism, distributing Buddhist remains found by archaeological excavations in the Indian subcontinent to Buddhist countries in Southern Asia was a way of erasing the hurt of being physically subjected through a linking of spirit and place. A sense of incompleteness was filled with the presence of the relics in their rightful place, allowing communities of belief, the sasana, to flourish again. This created a favorable terrain for reclamation from museums in Britain and reconsecration of Buddhist remains by leaders of a renascent Buddhist global movement, and by extension for the return of other secular artifacts. The King of Siam was recognized as the head of Buddhist subjects of the British Empire. And in 1897, when relics of the Buddha were discovered at his birthplace in Kapilavastu, the Viceroy, Lord Curzon, went to Bangkok and offered them to Rama V on condition that he share them with Buddhists elsewhere, namely in Sri Lanka and Burma. In 1909, the Shaji Kideri relics were distributed between Buddhists in Burma and Sri Lanka, Siam, and Japan. So colonial policies not only created new protocols of exchange and circulation, they acknowledged other sovereignties. During the last decades of British rule, demands for the restoration of Buddhist antiquities held in museums in Great Britain were received with some amount of sympathy by British authorities in Ceylon. In 1939, the Ananda Bhikkhu Sangamaya forwarded a resolution to the Secretary of State requesting that the relics of Venerable Sariputta and Moggallana, two disciples of the Buddha, lying in the Victorian and Albert Museum be returned. And this is quite a well-known example. There were, however, different epistemic fields of knowledge at play around Buddhist relics. The foiled attempt by the V&A Museum to keep the caskets and send the relics in plaster copies showed clearly that they did not believe in the sacrality of the remains. These relics were eventually displayed in Colombo in 1947 and returned in 1949 to Calcutta in what the Mahabodhi Society described as, quote, the homecoming of the sacred relics. Governor Caldecott in Ceylon, interestingly, acted as the intercessor on this occasion, as well as for the return some years later of the ivory sacred tooth of the Buddha. In 1934, it was reported that the Duke of Gloucester returned to the people of Ceylon the throne and crown of the kings of Kandy. The terminology and the location, the State Council chamber, reveal the centrality of Kandyan Buddhist heritage in the construction of the nation state to be. The Kandyan throne would also figure prominently in the independence ceremonies of Ceylon in 1948. Today, it rests in the Colombo Museum. The throne, taken as a war trophy to England, functioned as a contact relic or a relic by association in Hooper's terminology, since it would have been used by Sinhalese kings. It functioned in the same way as a relic would have in pre-modern kingdoms, providing ritual magical protection and buttressing the new government's claim to rightful rule. The ceremonial throne and footstool had in fact been fashioned by the Dutch in 1692 as a present for the then King Sri Wikrama. The throne was covered in gold sheeting and encrusted with jewels. Its arms were a pair of lions of Sinhala, and a large sun, symbolizing the origin of the Kandyan monarchs, surmounts its back. The Kandyan's throne authenticity was questionable, an object modeled in the Dutch style and possibly the work of South Indian craftsmen, was nevertheless adopted by Kandyan kings over their customary cushioned gaddi. After the 1818 rebellion, it was shipped to England together with the lion standard of the king as a present for the Prince Regent. The throne was used throughout the 19th century at Windsor Castle for the ceremony of investing Knights of the Garter. The nationalists chose to forget the origins of the throne, a gift of the colonizers made in a basic Louis XIV style, albeit with Eastern decorative motifs, and even falsified its date of creation in the museum's vignette, attributing it to an early reign of Rajasingha II, when the kingdom was at the peak of its power. The qualification of the Kandyan throne as a national symbol did not go uncontested. The vice president of the Kandyan Chiefs Union protested about the handing of the throne to the Ceylonese people rather than to the Kandyans specifically. The throne, first exhibited in the State Council, was later placed in the King's Pavilion in Kandy for inspection. As a sacred relic, it aroused awe and enthusiasm and galvanized crowds. It was then taken to the Colombo Museum, where, trapped in a glass cage, it occupied the bronze room as a prime exhibit. The cranium of Kapatipola, one of the leaders of a far-reaching rebellion of the Kandyan people in 1818, was returned to the Ceylon government on 9th February 1948, a few days after the country celebrated its independence from British rule. The Ceylon Observer on this occasion referred to the skull of the hero as a national relic, thus immortalizing its transformation from a war trophy to a national sacred symbol. For over 300 years, the Kandyan kingdom had withstood the full brunt of the military power in turn of the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British. With its demise in 1815, the entire island was for the first time subject to Western political control. From 1815 to 1817, a plan was hatched to overthrow British power. Kapatipola, as the Sava of Uva, assumed command and conducted the insurrection, which spread through the entire Kandyan country. In October 1818, Kapatipola and the second in command were captured, brought to Kandy, tried for levying war with a view of, quote, subverting His Majesty's government, and decapitated by sword. Kapatipola's cranium was presented to the Phrenological Society of the Edinburgh Museum by Henry Marshall, chief surgeon of the Kandyan provinces between 1816 and 1821. There, the skull was labeled number 19 on its forehead and placed in the same collection as other Ceylonese specimens, including Vaddas, Tom-Tom boys, and Sinhalese. Kandyan Buddhists in the early 19th century and those who claimed his skull found it unacceptable that the usual post-funerary practices for high-ranking Kandyans of cremation, collecting of the bones, giving of alms, and construction of a funerary monument were not carried out. Thus, for descendants of Kapatipola and members of his community in the 1950s, his cranium needed to be honored upon its return. Its transformation into a national relic that would serve to symbolize the reconquest of sovereignty by the people of Lanka was not their main concern. A request to return the skull was first made in the 1930s by the Anti-Colonial Student Association of the largest Buddhist monastic college. The request was forwarded by the governor to the colonial office. Acknowledging Marshall's role in taking away the cranium, he recommended that it be returned and placed in the National Museum in Kandy. The Edinburgh University Anatomy Museum was contacted and acknowledged having inherited the Phrenological Society collections, which included Capetipula's cranium. That was, moreover, quote, of not very particular interest. The cranium was returned by the Duke of Gloucester on his third visit to the island to the Minister of Education and then Colombo Museum. 2 years later, a great-grandson of Capetipula filed a suit against the ministers, asserting his own right of inheritance. The suit was dismissed. The skull was eventually displayed in Kandy in 1951 and rests today in a memorial urn erected in his memory in the outer courtyard of the Kandy Esplanade. The skull was entombed on November 26, 1954. So while Kandian culture had been successfully appropriated by the state as an emblem of authenticity, the place of return and rest of Capetipula in Kandy, in an outdoor space open to everyone, rather than in the confined museum building in the national capital, Colombo, shows a resistance on the part of Kandians to be fully nationalized. Even though the family court case was dismissed, it signaled a contest over the meaning of objects and attests to a yearning for a type of collective subjectivity distinct from the commodified, secularized national relic status that was assigned to it. For people in Kandy, the memorial crystallized memory by linking the past and the present in a more complex and personal manner that challenged the overpowering national narrative of a unified Sinhalese community. It remains as a memory peg of the distant time when Kandians were the only people battling colonial conquering armies, and of the not so distant time when Kandian chiefs had made a plea for a separate state within a federal Ceylon. It remains today as a remnant of a history that is threatened by forgetting. So to conclude, this paper has suggested correspondences and resonances between the 19th century circulation of Buddhist relics and the pre-independence return of secular objects taken forcefully by colonial powers. The compelling feature that these old and new relics share is a capacity to operate as a locus and conduit of power. Clearly, the choice of objects that were claimed reflected the self-image of the majoritarian nation state. And I ask myself two questions. Why were certain objects not claimed? For example, all those skulls that were in the Basel Museum and that belonged to very ordinary people and that were taken in 1936, for example. And my second question is, will the little Kandian cannon that will soon be returned by the Rijksmuseum to Sri Lanka be similarly reimagined as a national relic? These are, of course, rhetorical questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nira. And rhetorical questions are always welcome. I think they teach us a great lot. But before I will pose any questions or even open this up to the audience, I would now like to invite Amber for her thoughts on the panel. Thank you, Amber.
Kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou I tēnei pō. Thank you, Sarah and Larissa, for inviting me to respond to this panel session. And thank you also to the speakers for sharing with us your stories of how ancestral remains have, in one way or another, become symbols of ancestry, nationhood, and world heritage. Now, I say ancestral rather than human remains because from my cultural perspective, they are all someone's ancestors to one degree or another. And for me, time, in the sense of how long ago they died, in this context, is irrelevant. They all deserve to be returned home from where they were taken from. And this is reflected in the long history of repatriation requests that we've seen today and throughout the conference. Though the main aim of returning ancestral remains is to enable them to return to their descendants and to lay them to rest, the politics of these repatriations is unavoidable. Whether that's from the institutions who held them or the countries, nations, and peoples to whom they are connected. George shared with us the exploitation and extraction of cultural heritage, and I appreciate that he highlighted the fact that it is not the places and the people from which these ancestors belong who benefit from their study and existence. This continent's people have the longest history of all of us, and yet, or maybe because of this, the illicit trade of their cultural heritage, including their ancestors, still continues. The older the ancestor, it seems, the more contested they become due to their perceived scientific value. And the appropriation of other people's culture, particularly of such antiquity as those taken from Africa and present-day Indonesia, demonstrates that universalist views still exist in our museums and universities and research institutions. In the case of Africa, these ancestors, which come from the cradle of humanity, have their own value and status from the world's scientists. And I imagine they would have found it quite hard to let them go. And it may have been the same for the ancestor from Java, taken in the name of research and world heritage, to be requested for return home as a symbol of nationhood and identity. And debates over political and private ownership of remains of this nature is sadly still ongoing. And one of the questions that for me sort of came up in listening to these panels was, is being the type specimen a good enough reason not to be returned? And also thinking about some of the questions that Sarah posed earlier, particularly around why the treatment and return of paleoanthropological remains are seldom discussed in this context, is perhaps because, you know, we might understand our connection with them at an evolutionary level, but for some that connection is too far removed from a personal level, despite how we might understand them scientifically. We must also ask ourselves who benefits from the retention. If it's not the countries or communities of origin, then I think we really need to examine the ethics and morals of retaining these remains. And as Carolina and Fenneke noted on the Eurocentric view that scientific heritage should not be imbued with the emotion that cultural heritage does. I think this is easy for the scientists to say, but for the people to which these ancestors belong, you can't take that emotion away from them. I also find it interesting with regard to the political symbolism that ancestral remains hold for the countries that took them, becoming their cultural heritage or even world heritage, rather than acknowledging to whom they belong or originate. This is, as we know, typical of colonial politics and the reluctance to giving up the power that they once held. And in saying this, though, several countries are working to decolonise their practice and their museum. However, just how this is done and what this means for the countries which they colonise, for me, I am watching with interest. The symbolism that ancestors hold for their own people is another matter entirely. We heard about the return of Petipola from Sri Lanka as part of the celebrations of independence, a freedom fighter against the British, and his head was no doubt taken as a symbol of colonial power and made an example of. And this, unfortunately, has happened throughout the world more than we realise. But I think it's really important that these stories are told. To some degree, that same feeling of nationhood and cultural identity can also be seen here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The ancestral remains taken by Austrian Andreas Reichek in the 1880s were petitioned for return by representatives of a number of different iwi or nations within New Zealand in the 1940s. And then at the close of World War II, soldiers from the 28th Māori Battalion were planning to travel from Italy, in which they were stationed, over to Vienna on a rescue mission to return their ancestors and other cultural objects that were stolen by Rashek. Unfortunately, they were prevented from doing so by their superior officers. But what it shows is that there was a nationwide desire for these ancestors and sacred objects to be returned home where they belong. And thankfully today, some of those ancestors have begun making their way home. But we're not just dealing with colonial institutions overseas. So many of us are dealing with the effects of colonization within our own countries. And this can sometimes be a much harder fight. I work in the National Museum here in Aotearoa, and this museum has gone through 4 iterations of itself. This museum began its life being called the Colonial Museum. But for me, I am of the opinion is that you can change its name, you can make it bicultural, but it's still a colonial construct. And many of us are battling this from the inside as insurgents of sorts, in an attempt to decolonize our own museology and ensure that the cultural objects and ancestors held within those walls are reconnected with their descendants. They are not the nation's treasures, but they belong to living communities spread throughout our country. Te Hauki Tūranga, the carved meeting house, which you no doubt would have heard about at the beginning of this conference, was stolen by the colonial forces of our country and positioned pride of place into the Colonial Museum in the 1860s, and actually became a symbol for the nation, a symbol for Te Papa today. But little does the average visitor realise the people to whom this house belongs has been fighting for its return since the day it was taken. The ownership of this whare is now back in iwi hands, but the house itself is yet to be returned to Tūranga where it belongs. And when it does, New Zealanders who have for over 150 years understood this as a symbol for the nation will realise that it was never the nation's to begin with. Like the thousands of ancestors and cultural objects that are still out there and waiting to be returned, they are not symbols of nationalism in the colonial sense, or even world heritage. They should not be in the universalist spaces like the British Museum of Natural History. They should be home with their people. And I think George is right. Restitution is about people, past and present, ancestors and descendants. They're not specimens or objects. So we have a saying here in Aotearoa, and it goes, he mea nui o te ao, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. What is the most important thing in the world? It is the people, the people, the people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so powerful, and there was so much in that. I'm kind of taken aback. Does anybody from the panel want to comment on anything that was said? Fenneke, please go ahead.
Yes, I don't agree that the time that these the people the skulls are from died is irrelevant. I think it makes our discussions better and more nuanced if we take into account the differences between repatriations of human remains of people who are who've been someone's recent ancestors, and these human remains, which are not even human remains, they're hominid remains, pre-human remains. They are not someone's recent ancestor, and of course we could argue that in a way they're everyone's ancestor, and these people have not suffered under European Western colonialism. I do agree with you that it's important to take into account that these skulls are part of living communities. I think this is very important, that they have cultural and political significance, but that's also something that we can criticize, I think. In the case of Java men, this skull, the Java man skull, has become part of a very Java-centric Indonesian nationalist history at the expense of perhaps other Indonesian islands that haven't been given such a large role into this narrative. So I do think that's something to keep in mind in further discussions, that of course each of these skulls, as we've seen, has this cultural and political significance, but it's probably more useful to make a distinction between human remains of ancestors who've died more recently, and these ancestors who've died, well, in the case of Java men, perhaps 1 million years ago.
I think I just want to pick up maybe there. I think it's been a very fantastic discussion. When we talk about the history of man, of humans, for us, especially in Africa, we are not saying that we own that, but we are custodian of that. I mean, Africa has been custodian of the history of humanity, and communities have managed and ensured the survival of these places, and they have built relationships and symbolisms around them, even archaeological, paleontological sites. They are part and parcel of their living. So they are part of it. They are part of that. And I think that we should look at it as part of their being. And if you remove it from them, you are actually removing part of their being. And if we are going to create this distance, then you can also bring it between the Bible. I mean, Jesus and others, 3,000 years and all that. You can say it's so far distance that nobody is connected, but we are very connected. If you bring that to a religious person, you're in trouble if you start questioning, or Islam or that. So I think that irrespective of the age, the communities that from where these particular finds have been found have developed and have managed these areas and have, on behalf of humanity, managed to ensure that the history of humanity can be told. And I think that it is wrong to deny them or to take this particular history elsewhere in the name of science, leaving these communities sort of empty just because they have no direct connection in terms of the years. So for me, I think it is part and parcel of them, irrespective of the age. But of course, scientifically, we have to understand that there's a huge difference. And the Museum of Black Civilization that I was talking about, that we are involved, which is in Senegal, talks about Africa as being the custodian of that heritage, from that history, from Tumai, 7 million years, coming all the way in a continuous way so that humanity can be proud of itself. Now, there is a book here that we have just published, which is National Museums in Africa, Politics, Identity, and History. I'm one of the authors, just come out about 2 months ago. Some of these issues are actually discussed in that, if you are interested in looking at that. Then lastly is the question of Zambia. I can see from here, from Lian. Very little excavations have taken place in Broken Hill, I mean, in the 1950s. And some finds were found because this was a working site. So you don't expect much to have been found. But Zambia as a country holds a strategic position because it's in the center. Now, when this Broken Hill skull, which excited the world, was taken away as an act of colonial appropriation, Zambia remained without much interest. So whoever wants to do that goes to London to study that. You see, but if it was in Zambia, it would inspire young students, young people, children, people going to the museum, seeing the real ancestors, seeing the thing itself, to study. Now, what inspires them? Casts of the thing, they don't have that. So that is what we're saying. The real thing would inspire. It would bring scientists from other parts of the world to study, interact with the scientists within. And that is the dislocation that is in between. The idea of, piecemeal kind of, capacity building that the British Museum would bring to Zambia, I don't think that is what people are interested in. They want their heritage. They want to be the center of action. They want to be playing a role and having their own voice heard from Zambia, where this particular specimen belongs. Just like the Turkana boy plays a role in Kenya, just like the Lucy plays a role in Ethiopia, just like, all other numerous hominids in South Africa play those roles. And it's a big difference if you look at those countries that retain their heritage within their state boundaries.
Can I jump in, Sarah? Thank you. Thank you, Amber, for the lovely response to our presentations. I'd like to just come back to two issues that are connected. And the first one is, who are the people? And who are the people these remains or objects are going to be returned to? And who are those making the claims, and do they convey the wishes of all members of the community? And that's actually the point I was trying to get at in my presentation, is that the claims that were made during the colonial period and even after, until the 1980s, if you look at the list of objects, I think, that are requested to UNESCO, they display a very obvious majoritarian slant. I mean, these are the wishes. This is the wish list of the dominant group, and not only the dominant group, the dominant class. They are not interested in getting back the skulls of the farmer that rests in Basel Museum, and that was, I think, part of the collection, made part of the collection in the 1930s, which was also, desecrated in the same manner as Kapatipola, because in Buddhist societies, and he was probably a Sinhalese Buddhist, there are some 100 skulls, I think. It's absolutely imperative that you are cremated, and then your ashes are separated from the bones remaining. The ashes are dispersed in the river, and only the bones are kept, sometimes buried. So I think one has to really, of course, accept that it is absolutely necessary that these objects and these remains return. But I'm really concerned about those that are never going to be claimed and that are never going to be returned, because they are not, there's absolutely no voice for them. And what can one do about that? And is there anything that our colleagues in this part of the world, for example, can do to think about these issues?
I think that the last comment, it relates back to Noel's keynote in a way, right? So what's the responsibility of all of us in these questions? We have technically our panel is over, but we can overdraw a bit of time. I think the questions by Liane have both been answered, or her comments. So Jonathan put a plus in the chat. Do you want to ask your question?
Thank you very much. Am I audible? Can you hear me? Thank you very much.
Yes.
I'd like to ask a question to George, but really to everyone. Well, while you were speaking, I was really kind of struck. I found your argument about the kind of economic power and the brain drain related to the skull being taken away from Zambia very powerful. And I'm thinking about the potential consequences of framing the arguments in different ways. And I think Zambia is an excellent case here to illustrate my point. I'm wondering whether really the language of heritage and nationality and culture is the most effective, or whether it could be connected with something else. One of the reasons why I'm always a bit worried about language of heritage and nationality is that it can always backfire. It can awaken certain far-right nationalistic demons, as we see in South Africa or in India, where, you know, the discourse of nationality allowed to kind of combat British rule, but it also awakens today's kind of neo-fascist attitudes, as we see. So I wonder whether connecting it with a broader history of exploitation would be a useful strategy. And I wonder what all of your thoughts are. Because in a sense, focusing on human remains focuses on a very limited aspect of the whole colonial endeavor. And while the human remains were taken away, so were other resources. And Zambia is a case point here, because all the resources in general were being taken away and keep being taken away, as is the story, for example, of Zambian copper. And the multinational companies which keep exploiting Zambian's resources and really owe a big debt to Zambia. I just saw Glencore is one of the biggest multinationals that exploits copper in Zambia. I think one of the mines, the Mopani mine, is being now nationalized, but it costs us a huge debt to the multinational company. So there's a lot of kind of neo-colonial structures of exploitation that tie it to the past. And I wonder, could the human remains be tied to this kind of discourse and show how it's a legacy of material exploitation, not only of culture and heritage, but mostly of material exploitation, which impoverishes people physically, materially. And I wonder whether you think this switch to a kind of materialist discourse would be a useful political strategy or not. So that's my question. Thank you.
Just to comment very quickly, I think the points you've raised are extremely important. And the question for me is a question of language, it's a question of history, and even the language that we speak today. Is it a language that favors our agenda? What kind of agenda are we working on? Because when we talk about colonialism, has colonialism been done away with, particularly in Africa? What was colonialism about? Colonialism was not about coming to do the good for, you know, these harmless, beautiful people and all that. It was about expropriation. It was about expropriation of a lot of things. It involved genocide. It involved appropriation of labor, appropriation of the spirit of the people, appropriation of the cultures, appropriation of the mind and the body. And when we are talking about decolonizing, we also mean you have to decolonize that. And it came packed up with so many things. Even the church played a role. The industry played a role. So I think that we cannot limit it to kind of an emotional only or the right to return, but we have to open it up to a bigger language to look at really what colonialism was all about and to dismantle and disorient and disorganize and dismantle so that we can try to create a better world. And that's what I was saying. It's a matter of frank talking where we have to accept the past mistakes. And you've raised the issue of neocolonialism that continues in terms of the big companies that continue to appropriate those resources in the name of bringing development. Those issues also need to be looked at. So yes, but when it comes to issues of ancestors, the recent ancestors whom we know, the people who were buried, but then dug, taken away in the name of science, whether to Germany. And Germany, you have so many of them. You have thousands of them, mostly from Southern Africa, from Tanzania, even victims of war. I don't think that you need to develop another language for that. You just have to return them home. This was a process of genocide. This was a process of, robbing people of their spirit, of their body, of their ancestors. You don't need to negotiate. You don't need to, even if it's going to be bad for others to listen to that, you just need to return them back. We need them back. They need the spirit to rest back. Some people say that, of course, and I can see Jos van Buyden is having a hand up. He has done a great job, through his website, creating this awareness. Some people are claiming that, you need to build new museums, you need to do this for us to bring new things, you need to put up facilities. When some of these things were they taken because they were lacking being in good facilities? And I always say this, a time comes when we have to develop our own language to say to the big museums, even the British Museum, give us back that heritage, we will do what we want with it. If we decide to bury them in our, sacred forest, we will bury them, because some of these things are still keeping the spirits alive, roaming around, and the present population cannot rest. They need to be buried. Just as Nira was saying, talking about the local people who are killed, whose spirits need to be, they need to be cremated. What language do we need to develop on that? They just need to be brought back, be cremated, so that their spirits can rest. So there are different languages. And I think we need to decolonize the language and add the elements away, not only of the spiritual, emotional, but also the language of economics. So it's a whole world of discussion. It is not as simple and straightforward as that. So I agree with you. But I think there are others that are straightforward that we just need to go and say, you went and dug the graves, you got the bones, you said they are taking them for scientific research. These people need to come home and rest, and we're going to bury them. And some of these symbolic things that are important to us, that you've created new meanings for them, new Western meanings for them, they mean something for us, give them to us. And if we feel like burying them in our sacred forest, we will bury them. You don't have to see them. They were made to die, and they have to die.
Thank you. There's two hands up. There's Jos van Beurden's hand up and Wayne Modest hands up. But I was told I have to really cut at 12:40 and it's 12:39. So I do think I have to finish this this panel at this point. And I actually think that, George, your final statement was the perfect endpoint of this panel. And there's nothing that I want to add now that should be added. So I will just say thank you to all of you for this really interesting discussion, and thank you for joining in so lively and bringing in your perspectives to this topic. And I do hope that in the course of the conference we can actually pick up a few more of these thoughts, because they are not just related to the specific topic of this panel, but they are surely also useful thoughts for all the other panels that we had. We have one left, we have a final discussion left, and yeah, thank you again. And we will have a 15-minute break, and then we enter for the next panel on archives. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.